Hello chess buddies, welcome to Amateur Chess University. Today, we'll be looking into the analysis of the round 3 game of the FIDE Chess Grand Prix Leg 1 event that took place between Vidit Gujarati and Daniel Dubois. They both produced an absolute classic in the Tata Steel Masters event, and this game was no different. So without further ado, let's head straight into the game. Vidit here has the white pieces and he begins with knight to f3, going for the ready opening. Dubois replied with knight to f6, g3 by Vidit for the king's Indian attack, and g6 by Dubois going for the symmetrical defense of the king's Indian attack. Now Vidit played his light square bishop to g2 and Dubois played his dark square bishop to g7. Here Vidit pushed his pawn from d2 to d4, looking to take control of the center, and Dubois replied with pawn from d7 to d5. Here Vidit pushes his pawn from c2 to c4, going for the neo Grenfell defense, and Dubois played his pawn from c7 to c6, kingside castling from Vidit and kingside castling from Dubois. Now we have the original defense of the classical variation, one of the many types of neo Grenfell defense. Here Vidit brought his queen to b3, which is an attacking move targeting this diagonal, as well as a b file. And here Dubois pushed his a7 pawn to a5, going to play a4 next. Here c4 pawn captures a pawn on d5, and Dubois played his pawn from a5 to a4, targeting the queen. Now Vidit moved his queen back to d1, and c6 pawn captures a pawn on d5. Here Vidit developed his queenside knight, bringing it to c3, launching a double attack on the a4 pawn. Dubois developed his queen to a5, providing additional support to this a4 pawn. Here Vidit played his dark square bishop to d2, and Dubois developed his knight from b8 to c6, targeting the d4 pawn. This knight at c3 is very important for white because it's also controlling the e4 square and preventing the knight at f6 from coming to it. So it shouldn't be moved in the temptation of targeting the queen. So Vidit here pushed his e2 pawn to e3, adding another defendant to the d4 pawn. Here Dubois moved his queen from a5 to a6, stepping away from this diagonal. Now there are two games in the database with the same position where white moved the rook from f1 to e1. While one of those games was a draw, the other was won by white. However, Vidit here played his pawn from b2 to b3, and it is as of move 13 that we have a completely new game. a4 pawn captures a pawn on b3, and queen captures a pawn on b3. Now Dubois moved his knight from c6 to a5, targeting the queen, and Vidit moved his queen to b4, targeting the e7 pawn. Dubois in this position with the best move, that is bringing the knight back to c6, protecting the e7 pawn, while also targeting the queen at b4. Here Vidit brought his queen back to b2, and now Dubois moved his light square bishop to f5, controlling this diagonal. Now Vidit developed his rook from f1 to c1, targeting the c file, and Dubois brought his rook from f8 to c8. Now Vidit played his knight from f3 to e5, with his light square bishop active now, targeting this pawn at d5 twice. The best idea for Dubois in this position is to push his pawn from e7 to e6, defending the d5 pawn. However, he preferred to go for a queen exchange, bringing his queen to a3. Vidit accepts this by going for the queen exchange, capturing the queen at a3, and rook at a8 captures the queen at a3. Now Vidit pushed his pawn from g3 to g4, targeting the light square bishop at f5, and Dubois captured this pawn with his knight at f6. Now knight captures a knight on g4, and bishop captures a knight on g4. With the black's knight eliminated, the d5 pawn became defenseless. So Vidit captured the pawn at d5 with his knight. He had an interesting idea, and that was to capture the knight at c6 next. And when rook captures the rook at c6, then he will play his knight from d5 to e7, delivering a check while also picking up the rook. Dubois was pretty aware of this, so he moved his rook from c8 to a8, launching a double attack on this a2 pawn. Vidit countered this by playing his knight from d5 to b4, adding another defendant to this a2 pawn, while also launching a triple attack to this knight on c6. Here Dubois cannot go for an immediate knight exchange because if he captures the knight at b4, then Vidit will capture the knight at b4 with his dark square bishop, now targeting the e7 pawn. as well as the rook at a3, and at the same time attacking the b7 pawn with his light square bishop. So Dubov played a very interesting move to escape from this complex situation. He played his knight to a5, avoiding the knight exchange, while also providing support to the b7 pawn. Here Vidit moved his rook from a1 to b1, now preparing to bring his other rook to c7. The best idea for black in this position was to push the pawn from e7 to e5, because eliminating this pawn at d4 will activate the dark square bishop. However, Dubov pushed his dark square bishop to f8, but this was a bit of a passive move, giving advantage to white. Now Vidit moved his rook from c1 to c7, launching a double attack on the b7 pawn. And Dubov pushed his light square bishop back to e6, launching a double attack on the pawn at a2. However, Vidit blocks this beautifully by pushing his pawn from d4 to d5, targeting the light square bishop. Here Dubov cannot move his light square bishop to c8 because it's not just a passive move. It will also allow white to play rook from b1 to c1, launching a double attack. So after pawn to d5 by white, Dubov was forced to move his light square bishop to g4, but Vidit didn't stop attacking the light square bishop. He played his pawn from h2 to h3. Now what can Dubov play? If he pushes his light square bishop to h5, then it will be another passive move and it will become a non-active piece. So he moved his bishop to only available square now, that is f5. And now Vidit pushed his e3 pawn to e4, again attacking the light square bishop. But this opens up the third rank for black's rook. So Dubov captured the pawn at h3 with his light square bishop. Now his bishop at h3 is protected by the rook. However, Vidit was also prepared for this. He played his dark square bishop to c1, targeting the rook at a3. Here Dubov was forced to lose his rook in exchange for the bishop. So he captured the light square bishop on g2, and Vidit captured the rook at a3 with his dark square bishop. Now the pawn at e4 has no defense. So Dubov captured the pawn with his light square bishop, and Vidit moved his rook from b1 to e1, targeting the bishop at e4. Here Dubov played his light square bishop to f5. Now Vidit has to be careful here because Dubov is preparing to move his e7 pawn to e6 and target this knight at b4. And Vidit was aware of this. So he moved his knight from b4 to c2, preparing to bring his knight to d4 next. And Dubov went for the knight capture by his light square bishop on c2, and Vidit captured the light square bishop with his rook. Now if you look at this position, white has two rooks and a dark square bishop, and black has a rook, dark square bishop, and a knight. Black has more pawns with a better pawn structure, while white has all his pawns at a distance from one another. However, black is on the defensive because of this pawn at d5. If black tries to play pawn from e7 to e6, then white will capture the bishop at f8 or push the pawn from d5 to d6. So Dubov decided to eliminate this dark square bishop at a3, and he played his knight from a5 to c4. Now rook captures the knight on c4, and rook captures the dark square bishop on a3. Now Vidit played a move that ensures the white is at a complete advantage. So feel free to pause the video and try to figure out the move played by Vidit in this position. If you are able to figure it out, well done. The move played by Vidit in this position was pushing his pawn from d5 to d6. This is such a fantastic move from white because now white has a pass pawn in the form of d6 with only 2 steps away from obtaining the queen. The problem for black is the e7 pawn cannot capture the pawn on d6 because if it does so, then white will play rook from c4 to c8, pinning this dark square bishop. And if black moves the king to g7, then white will play rook from e1 to e8. Now the dark square bishop of black has nowhere to go, and white will surely end up capturing it, leaving black staring at a defeat. So after pawn to d6 by Vidit, Dubov moved his pawn from e7 to e6 with his dark square bishop targeting the pawn at d6. And here Vidit brought his rook from e1 to d1. Here Dubov was lost for options, so he captured the pawn on a2 with his rook, and Vidit pushed his pawn from d6 to d7, preparing to obtain queen in the next move. Here Dubov moved his dark square bishop to e7, and Vidit pushed his pawn from d7 to d8, bringing the queen. Now the dark square bishop captured the queen on d8, and rook captures the bishop on d8, delivering a check. Here Dubov moved his king to g7, and Vidit moved his rook to d7. Now the f7 pawn is pinned, and Vidit is preparing to bring his other rook to f4. Dubov understood this, so he played his rook from a2 to a5, and here Vidit played his rook from c4 to f4, looking to capture this pawn at f7. Now Dubov has no other option but is bring his rook to f5. Now Vidit gladly went for the rook exchange, capturing the rook at f5, and the e6 pawn captured the rook on f5. And here Vidit pushed his pawn from f2 to f4, and it was in this position on move 43 that Dubov resigned the game. So let's see why. Although Dubov has 5 pawns, it's not a match to a single rook. And this pawn at f4 covers the e5 and g5 squares, and it will be too difficult for the black king to make any progress on its own. So that's the reason why Dubov resigned the game on move 43. So that's the game. Both Dubov and Vidit continued from where they left off in that classical game from Tata Steel Masters, and it was Vidit once again coming out on top to secure a very impressive win. If you have any thoughts on the game, feel free to share below. Thank you for watching. Take care. See you.